Hi folks, thank you again so much for joining us today. My name is Janine and I'm the head of customer experience at Flair. And I'm so excited to be talking to three powerhouse people leaders about leadership development and really how critical it is to create a workplace culture where everyone can thrive. So in the next hour, we'll be discussing strategies and tactics and how to develop your leadership teams and how to create positive change within your organization in a time like no other. So without further ado, let me introduce our wonderful panelists. We've got Jennifer, People and Culture Director at Zip, Hiam, CEO and founder of the Culture Equation, and Sarah, Diversity Inclusion Leader at the Culture Equation as well. Ladies, thank you so much for taking the time to share your experiences and expertise with us today. Okay, so jumping straight in, we're all wanting to know more about each of you and your journey as a people leader, and I guess more importantly, why leadership development is important for organizations. Jen, do you want to go first?
Of course. First up, so I'm Jen. I'm the Chief of Staff to our CHRO here at Zip. In addition to that, I look after our US and new markets people teams. And I guess why leadership development is important to me is it makes my job a hell of a lot easier when there's good leaders at a business. Also helps you scale your culture as well when you're growing really quickly, like a company like Zip. In the last 12 months, have gone from about 400 to close to 1,000 people, 10 regions, acquisitions, all that good stuff. So there's nothing more important than leadership development when scaling your culture.
That's pretty impressive. That's really impressive growth, and particularly in the last year that we've had as well. Hiam, I know you've had some experience in startup growth as well, so keen to sort of hear from you, from your perspective, from leadership development and why that's important in your journey, really.
Thanks, Janine. Hi, I'm Hiam and CEO and founder of the Culture Equation. And we help scale-ups primarily to develop high impact, high performing and healthy workplace cultures. Because we believe that's the kind of culture that creates a place where people want to go to. In terms of why that's all important and why leadership is important, I really do believe that culture is felt in the interactions and the human interactions every day between people. That's where it lives and breathes. And I believe that it is the organization's leaders, founders that set the tone, that role model, and that make it all very real for that organization in terms of what the expected culture is.
Makes sense. And Sarah, I know from a diversity and inclusion perspective, and obviously the last 12 months have been a challenge in good ways and bad ways for most organizations. Keen to understand from your perspective as well, from a D&I perspective, what is leadership development and how can we sort of start working towards that?
Yeah, thanks, Janine, and hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be here today. So a little bit about myself. I'm a diversity and inclusion leader. I'm also a consultant and an organisational coach. So I'm lucky enough to work with Hiam at the Culture Equation, as well as running my own consulting and coaching business, working with organisations around Australia to help create a place where culture and inclusiveness and leadership capability can thrive. And I also specialise in the disability and LGBTQ inclusion space as well. In terms of how it's important from a D&I perspective, I think working from home and COVID has been a really interesting space and an interesting challenge, which I know we'll delve into more shortly, but particularly for people who don't necessarily have mobility in the same way as others, there's actually been some really interesting opportunities that have been presented for people throughout this time. And in terms of why it's important, I think that people genuinely stay at organisations for their leaders, and that's why they leave as well when it doesn't go well. And it's true that people really remember how you make them feel. I think we just spend so much time at work. Why wouldn't we create a space where people can thrive and be empowered and bring their whole selves to work? And just lastly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm joining from today, which is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging.
Thank you, Sarah. So on that, I think just following that through, how would you define high performance leadership, given that you've obviously worked across industries and also different types of businesses? What is that sort of common thread across all around high performance leadership?
It's really the human element. It doesn't matter what the business is. It doesn't matter what the industry is, the focus, the diversity pillar, the leadership style. It's really that humanistic element that we all crave in leadership. And it's that really strong sense of self. So self-awareness and emotional intelligence, which is what makes a crucial leader. And I don't think anyone's really born with leadership skills. You can bring that energetic approach that can make you a good leader, but in terms of learning how to do it well, it takes that self-awareness and the emotional intelligence, and it's really that growth mindset as well. So the ability to be able to make mistakes, learn from them, talk about them loudly, take responsibility when you make a mistake, and that's critical when it comes to transformative inclusion work. So not simply transactional that focuses on policies and procedures, but really working with people and being able to wade into those uncomfortable spaces that don't only challenge how we see businesses and society and the world, but also how we see ourselves. So that real personal identity piece is really important. And I think being able to empower others through creating a safe space is crucial for leadership. And that's why I'm such a passionate advocate of psychological safety. It's critical in creating a space where people can make mistakes and try something different and share when something isn't going well. I think finally as well, that insatiable learning, the insatiable hunger for learning, I think is a really critical skill for leaders. We're working and operating in a world that's constantly changing, and as leaders we need to be able to grow and adapt with it if we're to create a space that enables all people to bring their best, baddest selves to work.
Jennifer, following on from, I guess, Zip and going to that massive trajectory you mentioned from a couple of hundred to a couple of thousand to obviously multiple territories as well, how have you found that sort of high performance leadership has had to change to manage that growth that you've been on?
So it very much is building for the phase that you're in. And so when we built our approach to leadership here at Zip, it very much was built in the context of where we were as a company in that scale-up phase, not startup, not big enterprise. And so it is kind of meeting people where they're at. For me, the whole concept of high performance leadership has to be about impact. Like, yes, you can be a great leader, hold great space, bring great teams together, but that high performance leadership to me is about impact, how you make people feel, but then also what are some of those hard kind of outcomes and value that's being delivered to customers as well.
Okay, so that makes a lot of sense in terms of, I guess, the traits, and that no one's really born with natural leadership ability. It's something that we have to work on. Hiam, I'm pretty curious, as I continue my own career, really, it's around this notion that leadership takes work, and kind of following on from what Sarah mentioned, effort is not always easily measured or really immediate in many ways to be a really good high-performing leader. How do you gauge or measure if the approach or strategy that you're taking is really working?
It's a really good question, and I could go into sort of, you know, the nuts and bolts of engagement surveys or upward feedback surveys or pulse surveys, but I'm not going to. I think that, as I mentioned before, it all resides in human interactions, and I remember the day that this became very clear to me was when I joined my previous employer, which was Google. It was day one, 80 people joining at the exact same time. I've told the story, and I know, Jen, you've heard it, but in a crowded room of a mix of Europeans from every country across Europe, I felt very, very inadequate all of a sudden. I had that moment of, oh my God, they've let me in and they haven't realized they've made a mistake. And I remember in that moment of deep fear and anxiety that somebody started calling my name across this massive room. And I thought I actually was being singled out for some reason. I didn't think it was a good thing, but it was my new manager coming across the floor trying to find me and saying to me, I know you must be feeling absolutely terrified. I'm here to just welcome you, tell you that, you know, we're so excited to have you join the team. We're upstairs waiting for you for lunch. Please join us. The whole team is looking forward to seeing you and meeting you. And in that interaction, in that one moment, all these sorts of anxieties, fears went away. I felt valued. In the coming weeks and months, I learned so much from this person. To this day, 12 years later, I keep in touch with him. That for me is the measure of an amazing leader. And he's somebody that internalized the culture and what was expected of him at Google, but with his own personal values. There was this beautiful congruence with how he was as a person and how he was to show up in this organization. And, you know, in terms of, you know, people and culture specialists out there, go and ask for these kinds of stories. See what, you know, people's first day was like. What was it like to join this organization? And see what kinds of stories come to the service. Are people feeling valued from day one? Are they feeling like they're part of a team? Are they feeling like 1 + 1 is going to equal 3? I'm just going to be able to do much more in this organization than I can do in any other organization.
Makes sense. And I think that's some really good insights into what great looks like. And I think, you know, we've spent the last few minutes talking about what great looks like. And I think the characteristics of a thriving organization where people can come to work and be their whole and best selves. I think it brings to mind for me the challenges of the past year. And I think how in the face of extraordinary circumstances, leaders or great leaders can really steady a ship. And I think while it's important to recognize what great looks like, it's probably equally as important to sort of recognize what not so great looks like. And we are all human and exceedingly human at that. So Jen, kind of keen to hear from you. You've worked at high growth startups like both Safety Culture and Zip. Both have had remarkable growth and hundreds of new employees and also exceeding $1 billion valuations, which is no easy feat. And we know that when businesses grow rapidly, you know, leadership and cultural dynamics can change tremendously. So from your perspective, what leadership problems or common themes have you recognized as startups sort of transition through those different growth stages?
Yeah, and I think the stages thing is the key component there, that when you are growing so quickly, it is like a new company every 3 to 6 months. And that does mean that there's different leadership needs for those different phases. So at the start, you're looking at your founding team, your really scrappy kind of owners and also doers at the same time, painting the walls and the floors. And then as you start to get a little bit bigger, start to get some funding, you do need some leaders that are kind of comfortable at that next level. And that sometimes means that there's a tour of duty where there is turnover at that leadership level. Probably the biggest thing for me is hiring people with high self-awareness. And so really pressure testing in interviews, like tell me examples where you've gone above and beyond and where have you failed? Like more importantly, where have you failed a customer, and tell me more about that and why, and what would you do differently? Because people that can't talk about their weaknesses and areas for improvement are going to be very unlikely to be able to succeed and realize when the kind of company's outgrown their pace of growth as well. I like to call them leadership smells sometimes. So you start to the little symptoms that you start to notice. There's some smells around. It might be Glassdoor posts. It might be engagement survey feedback. Kind of said as throwaway things in drinks or offboarding chats. Any of those moments where you can kind of listen and smell the little differences often means there's a much bigger problem sitting somewhere underneath that you've got to kind of crack through and understand and get to the bottom of.
Makes sense. And how frequently would you gatekeep, or I guess in your words, smell test it, if you will?
So like particularly when you're remote, the whole idea of a listening strategy means you have to be a lot more deliberate and intentional about it. And a big part of why we set up our people team having people partners and or business partners or people partners for different parts of the group, whether it's geographies or functions, is so that they can like deeply get to know the team, start to notice where team members might be logging on at different times, people's energy levels might be different, the way people look is different, or the people that are kind of connecting looks a little bit different. So the people partner model is a big part of that. But then also thinking more holistically, engagement survey is one thing, but it's only one tiny component of a listening strategy. Some of the other things, like even during COVID, this recent lockdown, we've been doing connects with different parts of the business. So like mums groups, women at Zip, millennials at Zip, like all these different types of groups just to listen and hold space for people. And then other things as well around equipping managers with some good questions to use in one-to-ones, like even just understanding energy levels out of 10. And so trying to provide some of those repeatable, scalable things that different managers and people partners can use help to kind of keep a tap on the pulse on it. And then when something does pop up, you can kind of dig into it in a bit more detail.
Yeah, and that aspect of sort of emotional intelligence as well, and really working hard at recognizing those signals in others as well, particularly in a remote environment, which is posing its own challenges as well. So makes perfect sense. Hiam, I know much like Sarah, you've worked in, Jennifer, you've worked in startups and obviously established Google's leadership development program in Australia. When working with leadership teams, how can you recognize some of those problems, or what are those early indicators that there might be a problem either in the leadership team or how that leadership team is being developed?
I think just building off what Jen said, sometimes the pace of growth of an organization outstrips the pace of growth of the individuals. And you can see those cracks forming, and with, you know, some good interview techniques that can be uncovered, and you can then make a decision, or they can make a decision, whether they want to upskill and build the capabilities needed for that next phase of growth, or whether it's actually their sweet spot to go back maybe into another organization that was at this phase that they thrived at in the organization that they're in right now. So looking at that, those are some of the things that might show up. In terms of the kinds of organizations that we work with, I mean, they're expected to do in 5 years what most organizations do in 25. So I'd be floored if there wasn't cracks showing at some point, and that's often in amongst building a team. So it's really incredible what's being asked of these organizations. And so we've gone out to do a little bit of research on what exactly it takes to be that sort of X factor leader in these organizations, and it's really quite specific. So learning what is required from a leadership team in this type of high growth, high scale organization is really important for founders to dig into, solve for the leadership team of the future, not for the problems that they see right now. If that makes any sense.
Makes perfect sense. And do you find, just following that through, but do you find that it's very specific to each company, or are there common themes across, I guess, all companies really?
There seems to be common, yeah. In terms of the kinds of leaders, so the sort of high-level C-suite leaders that seem to thrive in the high-growth companies, like the Zips of the world, like the Safety Cultures, the Atlassians, they seem to be motivated by similar factors or similar themes. One is that obviously they want to, you know, satisfy their own intrinsic motivations. So usually that's around learning and building on skills. And usually they move from getting their kicks out of building a product to building a team. And building the culture within that organization. So being part of that cultural sort of design and implementation phase is something that really drives them. So that's some of the things that I've noticed as I've interviewed them. There's so many other things. We're going to write an article on it and publish it. So please hold for that as we consolidate all that great information.
Well, yeah, share it through. I'm sure I'll be absolutely fascinated, and I'm sure our audience would be too by those themes. And I guess, and we'll get to a little bit later in terms of the war of talent, of how do we stop looking and tracking these qualities that we want in our teams. Sarah, I know when there are, as Hiam mentioned, when there are leadership problems, or you have indications that there might be something sort of just under the surface, what impact does that have on an organization and the culture? So what are those behavioral differences that you can really start to see in employees when, you know, culture is not quite, or leadership is not quite where it should be?
There's obviously those key big markers, such as the higher turnover and, you know, losing more people from the team. But then I think there's those more subtle markers as well, which is the behavioral differences that you start to notice in people. So people will step back, they'll become hesitant to share their perspectives, they'll become hesitant to take a risk and call out when something's not going well. And then that kind of sameness and uniformity starts to become rewarded. And we all know that's not good for business, it's not good for individuals, it's not good for society, but it's those little behavioural differences that you start to notice. And you can actually quite easily start to observe that by whose opinion or perspective is sought out in a meeting or in a room, who has more airtime, who doesn't, what's the impact of that, how decisions are made as well. We can start to see that decisions are made in a different way when leaders aren't showing up with that sense of openness or proactive seeking of feedback. And that's when one of those real challenges starts to present as well, when leaders become defensive, particularly personally defensive. And as I said earlier, in a world that's so rapidly changing, if we don't grow with it, there's a real sort of temptation to push back from a personal perspective rather than proactively asking the question, what's wrong and what's going wrong and what can we do to help. And being able to kind of wade into that discomfort is really important. And particularly for diverse populations who, you know, whether that be people of different genders or LGBTQ people, people with disabilities, those who are culturally diverse, our First Nations populations as well, operating in a system that, you know, systemically oppresses them becomes all the more challenging when leadership practices aren't proactively inclusive. So we start to see that those groups not only suffer, but become less represented. And what we know is the impact of that is there's less thought leadership and less diversity, less creativity and innovation in those products. So one of the quickest and easiest ways to see when leadership maybe isn't going well is listen for the other voices. How are people sharing their perspectives, and who's sharing their perspective, and who feels safe to do that and who doesn't?
I'm keen to sort of dive into techniques, or tactics really around, I know we've spoken about what it means to have a thriving organization, what those traits are of good leaders, or what those indicators are that your leadership team is going really well. Following on from that, Sarah, I know giving a voice to the voiceless, for lack of a better word, is what sort of tactics do you have for us to go about changing that? So we've noticed these indicators that, you know, things might not be quite where it should be. What would the first thing be that you would do? Where do we start, I guess, is the question.
One of the key steps to take here is proactively calling out that it's not always comfortable to have these conversations and to give permission for that. That is a crucial step. And that's why psychological safety is one of the key reasons and the underpinning components of a high-performing team, because without it, everything else can potentially fall down. So psychological safety is set by creating an environment where people feel like they can be honest, they can take risks, they can share something that might go against the grain, for example. So being able to do that simply by calling out, this is what we want to do. We want to create a safe environment, and asking what can be done for each person to feel that way is really effective. And that also really kind of embraces and empowers a growth mindset as well, because it enables people to be able to make mistakes, try something different, use inclusive language that maybe they're not necessarily used to, and perhaps get it wrong and try again. So that psychological safety component is really important. And also making it real. We all know that 70-20-10 rule of learning, but we're still so focused a lot of the time on skills uplift and that push of skills onto people, which is crucial and really important from a leadership perspective. But it's also really important for people to be able to see themselves in that, go out into the working world, try it, put it to practice, fail, and share those experiences with others. And in a space where I found this works really well, and this is something that Hiam also runs at the Culture Equation, which is one of her brainchilds, is a group coaching program, which means that a leadership team goes through the same program every 2 weeks, which is a focus on a particular piece of content, and then they are group coached together. So the beautiful element of that is it provides permission, and I think it gives visibility to the shared challenges that all leaders have, and creates that psychological safety to share that vulnerably in that setting, but to also go out, try it, come back and say, I tried it and it really sucked and it was uncomfortable, but this is what I learned and this is what I do next time. So making it real, setting the psychological safety, and taking a coaching approach to leadership development are some of the strategies that I've seen to be most beneficial.
Yeah, you can't really change what you don't acknowledge, right? It's actually being comfortable and being vulnerable. I think that creates that trust, really, which is vital and important, especially when you're trying to create that safe space for people. Here, I know what's worked from your, where does one start? I guess, you know, obviously your experience with Google and everything as well, but where does one start?
I think we always look to whether there are some simple cultural pillars in place. You know, simple cultural pillars like the why do we exist, the purpose behind the organization. Is that clearly articulated? Does it roll off the tongue of any individual in the organization that you might ask that question to? Do people feel very connected to that? I think that's a really important place to start. And the same with the values, whether the values have been inclusively created, not just in a room with one or two people, but, you know, with whoever is in that organization at that time. And do people really understand the behaviors that fall out of those values? What does good look like when we're demonstrating behaviors that are aligned to these values? Can we make decisions? I know, for example, Zip made a great decision recently on parental leave that was very closely linked to their values, and something that I remember hearing it took them very little time to make and that decision because of that
10 days. 10 days from idea to market launch.
I think you should talk about that, Jen, because it's just a simple example of how these cultural pillars can lead to great decision making across an organization, and really helps to then further embed the culture you want to create. So maybe Jen, you could talk that one through.
Yeah, so it does come down to values and being values led and kind of walking the talk. And a big part of where we decided to start at Zip was, one, to listen, and then understand the context in which, like, where we were at as a business, and design to solving the problem for now, and then also that next phase of growth, but then have that kind of underpinned and aligned with our values. Like a lot of them around stronger together, owning it, changing the game, and being customer first, like are very strong pillars around management as well. And so very much started with data, both the qualitative data from like interviewing people, both customers, leaders, and managers, a whole bunch of different people around what good looks like, and then what the gaps were, coupling that with some really good data around engagement survey, attrition, promotions, and all that good stuff. And then from there, kind of built what we wanted. And that's how we approach everything. There's a listen component, there's a data component, but there's also a heart component. And that's very much where the parental leave policy came from. The Zip, for those that aren't aware, it's for anyone that's suffered pregnancy loss in the first, I think it's 20 weeks of pregnancy. Zip's offering paid leave to cover that. And then also in addition to our primary and secondary carers leave, that's really flexible, like paid return part-time, get paid full-time. And that was based on data, listening, but also a bit of heart as well.
Wonderful. And I guess, Jen, following on from that, many of the businesses that I certainly work with in that small and mid-sized sort of space, sometimes the people leader might not necessarily feel that they have the authority to call out when they recognize either a leadership problem or a development opportunity, for example, the new policy that you guys rolled out at Zip. So how can people leaders go about raising this topic, or at least with the leadership team, sort of kickstart change in the organization?
So it does start from meeting leaders where they're at. So there's some leaders and companies that might have an appetite for it. And if they're values led and they say feedback's important, then if you raise feedback and they don't take it on board, then that's a much bigger problem in itself. So there's very much kind of starts with meet people where they're at. But then data as well is super important to hold that mirror up to someone's face. If you're coming in with opinions and kind of gut feels, a lot of stakeholders don't necessarily take that the right way. And so I always like to tie it down to what motivates that person. So let's say I want to convince you, Janine. I'm starting to think about, well, what motivates you? If you're a founder, it might be speed, it might be growth, it might be customer impact, and then trying to tie what I've observed or what I'm proposing to help deliver on that, and tailoring that in a way that hopefully, like if you do the good old DISC or any of those personality profiles, how do you like to receive information? I'm going to serve it to you how you like it, with some data on the side, and then hopefully that helps give you the mirror, or at least some next steps that you can at least try as an experiment.
Makes perfect sense. It's very direct feedback. I do like. Quick question on the on data specifically. You mentioned earlier employee surveys. Were there any other techniques or tactics that you used to capture that information?
Yeah, so particularly in the context of if we were to build our own, when we did build our leadership program, and with anything that we build, so at the moment we're doing leadership principles and pieces like that. We've run a series of kind of focus groups with different cross sections of leaders across the business, then more one-to-one interviews across like a cross section, and then also a survey separate to our engagement survey as well on some of the key areas that we're looking for more insight on. We can also couple that with any kind of verbatim that people partners have, and then the whole suite of people metrics across, like if there's attrition in certain areas, it might be different tenures are resulting in different outcomes in terms of engagement scores, even DEI factors as well. We have DEI scorecards for each team as well, and you can see that some team members with different like areas of diversity score differently in engagement survey scores. So we really are looking at, well, yes, your engagement survey is one thing. We are looking at doing more of a pulse as well, instead of it just being that kind of 6-month survey. But it really is a mix of like your hardcore numbers as well as more of those listening pieces as well.
Thanks for sharing that Jen. So I kind of want to change gears a little bit and talk about examples of leadership development programs that you've all been part of or at least implemented. So what were the key learnings in that for those of the folks in the audience who might want to go away and sort of start putting to practice some of these ideas that we've sort of shared today? Where would one start, but also what are some of the learnings that if you could do it all over again, you would do it differently? Hiam, do you want to go first on that one?
Sure. Well, as Jen mentioned, and also Sarah actually facilitates a lot of our programs, and we try to meet the organization where they're at on their journey, and we try to get them to really articulate, where are you at? Simply put, are you a startup? Are you scale up? Where are you at in your growth trajectory? What's expected of leaders at this stage? And we ask that separately of all the exec leaders in that organization. We try to see what are the key things that keep coming up again and again and again. And then we build a program around that. So we build a program, again, where that company is at, where they need to be, where the leaders in the organization will need to be in order to meet that growth. And we pull together a custom piece that we then hand over to them. Similar, we've done that for Flair. We just don't want to hang on to that necessarily. Want to build it, and then we want you to own it. And I know Jen has rolled out a kind of a train the trainer type model for her leadership development program, and I thought that was fabulous. That was all credit to Zip, training up your own leaders to deliver, not professional facilitators, your own leaders to deliver this program for their next level managers. Was a really brave thing to do, but it really gave that ownership and spoke to that value around ownership to those leaders. And then as Sarah mentioned, we have a very different approach in terms of breaking up programs into teeny tiny 90-minute sessions, topic driven discussion with our coaches that can go in any which direction. So you really need skilled coaches for that type of program. Those coaches help to create bespoke challenges based on that topic of discussion that those people will bring back to their organization, actually try out some new experiments, some new ways of working, and then come back and debrief, and we can actually see how they got on together as a group. So that's great for a leadership team that are time poor, but really want to get hands-on and experiment quickly and learn and grow. Yeah.
And do you find in terms of those sort of sessions that the leadership team needs to come wanting change as well? Is there any sort of mindset that they need to be in ahead of actually making sure that they are, fully present and actually able to enact those changes once that session's done?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, something that I think both Flair and Zip did was use these leadership programs as a forum to actually create, for example, our shared vision of what good looks like from a leadership principles perspective. Yeah. So you tend to see leaders get very involved because these are, again, those cultural pillars that will guide that organization forward for years and years to come. So that's great when you can use this as a forum to co-create and design something that's now going to be a leading principle going forward. That's fantastic. You don't have to use bringing everyone together just from let's build our skills. That's great. Let's build our capability and our confidence. We can actually use this forum to make decisions, and that's even better, which is awesome.
Makes sense. Sarah, from your perspective as well, I'm keen to hear, how can we do those sessions in a more, inclusive way, and giving a voice to those that, might not be as vocal as others?
Yeah, great question. It's something that I keep coming back to, which is that psychological safety and just creating the space for people to make mistakes, particularly when language and social issues continue to develop so much over time. It would be an unreasonable expectation to expect all leaders to know all of the language and how to operate with every diverse group. So a big part of it is really kind of giving that permission that learning takes time and it can be uncomfortable. And I think oftentimes there's this approach to leadership that's very sort of ninja based. Like, there's this assumption that you have this kind of leadership outfit on, and no one can know that you're this person who's trying on leadership. You just have to know it all. And it's actually okay to kind of break that fourth wall and say, I'm a human too. I'm just practicing this. I'm trying it out. I'm learning in my own way. And that's where I think a blended learning approach is really important to any leadership or any development program, really, to make sure that it speaks to all of those adult learning styles, that there's bold, innovative thought leadership pieces that people can absorb who work best, you know, in a solo learning capacity. There's that collective learning that happens in group coaching. There's the going out and trying it and talking about it with others. And a space that I've seen that work really well was an organisation that I worked with that really gamified their learning program. So they actually had a bit of an app where each time you practice a leadership skill, you nominated someone else to do it, and then that person nominated someone else, and there was this really high visibility around it. But what it did was it just provided permission to make mistakes, essentially. Yeah. And when it comes to the inclusion piece, what's really important, oftentimes when inclusion is discussed, it's talked about in this broad way, and it's talked about in a way that kind of expresses that everyone should be included. And that's absolutely true. Everyone should be included. However, there are some groups who have very unique challenges that other groups don't have. And it's important for a leader to be able to understand some of those unique challenges, because if you don't feel comfortable leading everyone, then it's very difficult to be a strong leader. And that means even people that are different to you in terms of their communication styles, their cultural background, their willingness to speak up, whatever it might be, their learning styles, their abilities. We need to be comfortable in that space where we don't have all the answers. And I think a key component there from a development perspective is, I suppose, giving leaders permission to not have to know all the answers, but know that the people with the lived experience do. So sometimes it's as simple as asking someone in your team or someone that you might be recruiting for, what do you need to thrive? It can be as simple as that. What helps you feel the most empowered, and how can I show up as the best leader for you? And let them know that you're trying and you're learning and you're taking those steps, but you might not always get it right. And I think that just allows leaders to kind of exhale and acknowledge that it takes time, but that they're showing up with the right intention.
Yeah, right intention, but also leading with that, you know, we're all exceedingly human in these times as well. And it's okay to not know everything all the time. And I think sometimes as a leader, and certainly from my experience as a leader or manager, it's like we've sort of been trained to go, you have to know every single answer that comes your way. And breaking down those walls and kind of being a little bit more vulnerable in that fragility of humanness is really creating the trust with the team as well. And it goes both ways.
Absolutely. And if I can quote Queen Brene Brown, she talks a lot about being armoured, and that approach previously in leadership, that was rewarded to be armoured, but we shouldn't actually reward that approach. And if we started to reward vulnerability and uncertainty and growth, then leadership development would look very different, and that would enable a whole range of people to step up to the plate, not just those who can practice that armouring.
Yeah, it's following Jen's statement earlier. It's leading with heart, really, along with data and everything else as well, but it's leading with being a human first. Jen, from I guess from Zip, and obviously I'm super curious about how you guys are progressing through it as well, but where would you start, or do you have some examples in terms of the leadership development programs that you guys have set up, and what are some of those tactics that the audience can sort of take away?
Yeah, I guess there's I often learn better from where you get it wrong, and I wouldn't say it was a complete fail, but there was definitely some things that we could learn from. But with safety culture, when we built our first manager program or leader program, we definitely pitched it at that leader level. So a lot around like vulnerability and self-awareness and all this great stuff. And we had great feedback, but then people followed up and were like, so how do I have that difficult conversation? Like, how do I set a goal? Like, what's a one-to-one? And so it was really, it was almost those like 101 trivial basics where we really needed to start. And so I think there's a first part around just really understanding where your people are at, what their needs are. And a lot of the time you can't jump to the top of the staircase. You've got to kind of take it step by step. And so there's a big part around being really realistic around where you're at, listening, kind of combining that with also some aspirational ones, but it's like pick one or two aspirational components that you want to get to, because realistically you're only going to be able to build a couple of them in addition to the basics at the same time.
Yeah, and what was the process for prioritizing, obviously, the key components of that?
So I always like to call it there's a bit of a founder factor. So typically you'll find in a founder-led business, there's a couple of things that like are niggly in their mind that they want solved. And so it's often there's a little bit that comes from the bottom, from the people. There's a bit that comes from the people team that are like foundational basics you just need to do well, like one-to-ones, feedback and goals. And then there's a couple of things that come from the founder, which like at Zip and Zip pace. So how do you operate at a speed that's unimaginable and make decisions in that ambiguity and complexity? And then from a people team, it is those manager basics. And then particularly what we heard a lot from the group was, well, how do we actually manage with that humanity, with well-being and remote and burnout and all those different things that kind of come at it as well. So it was kind of those three different components that was our feedback approach to kind of design where we landed with our manager dev program.
Great, thank you guys so much for that. I want to sort of jump in and take some audience questions. So folks in the audience, if you have any questions for Sarah, Jen or Hiam, please just pop them into the chat panel next to the screen share and let us know who they actually directed to as well, and we'll take these additional questions at the end of the session. So I'll quickly kick off with a pre-submitted question from Carolyn and Tina, who asked a very similar question. Sarah, this one's for you. How can leadership teams effectively communicate and engage employees in a remote setting? And do you have a few examples of successful tactics?
Yeah, absolutely. This was something that I saw the organisation that I work at in professional services do quite well, and also a number of other organisations that I consult to. So one of the key components, I think, is kind of shaking up your communication platforms. So we're so overloaded with media and COVID updates and 11 a.m. news updates for those of you living in Sydney at the moment, and it's just an absolute influx. So shaking up those comms and doing it in a way that's new and fresh can be really effective. So our CEO did a fortnightly video update around what was happening, what supports were available. He featured his golden retriever every fortnight, which just made it absolutely that much better for me. And it was just, it felt personal in a world where we're so influxed with written communications. I found it really effective. And I think creating those opportunities for connection is something that I saw be really effective last year as well, especially for those organisations that have, and Jen mentioned some of these earlier, those employee resource groups and networks can provide a really kind of structured space for connection, particularly for people who are from diverse backgrounds who can kind of share what those experiences are like. For those people who maybe being at home and working from home might not be the safest space. So for example, people who are in domestic and family violence relationships, or people who are transgender and might not necessarily have that degree of family support, sometimes those employee resource groups can create a really strong space for connection. Yes. So that might be through running one-on-one sessions to help your people understand what the purpose of those networks are, the other social connections, you know, the bingo, all of those other pieces as well. I think it's also really important to enable rituals. So it's so important to do that in a time where we don't have the opportunity to have different physical locations. So how can you create a space where your people can celebrate achievements, mourn losses, and embrace change in a way that feels new and different when you can't change up your physical environment? So that might be through a whole host of different strategies that you can use, and different kind of meeting techniques and encouraging walking meetings and so on. I think also acknowledging that what everyone needs is different. I found it such an interesting ongoing study in human behaviour around COVID in terms of what people need and what is really triggering. And some people need a lot more personal connection with their team, and others actually don't want that and need the space for their own mental health. So being a strong leader means being able to be flexible and respond to the shifting needs of your team. And lastly, I think for individuals as well, finding ways to find your third space, which is really important. So I'm sure many of you on the call that have joined today, particularly in a HR capacity, your calendar is back to back with meetings, and you literally click exit and enter back into a meeting. So how can you find a third space in between? And that might be, you know, walking around the block. It might be getting changed. I know in our team, we leave loudly at the end of the day at times. So we'll say, okay, I'm leaving now, I'm signing off, that's what's happening. might be patting your dog, and at the end of the day, I'm partial to some ugly dancing around the kitchen to country music to kind of slice up the day. Whatever you can do, just encouraging people to do things that actually work well for them, to help them help them stay engaged, but also to be connected to their people, and importantly to be able to switch off as well.
That makes perfect sense. Yeah, we do something very similar in our the customer experience team. As simple as it is, it's one of the most ritualistic things we have, where every single morning and every single evening we say good morning and good night. And that we did probably back when COVID first happened about a year or so ago. And it's just the one thing that, whether we're in the office or not, it just becomes that sort of check-in and check-out that you do every day. And it just kind of keeps folks really connected along with the weekly team meetings. And we do have musical bingo as well, which helps. So Jen, I've got one for you that's come through from Matt, who asks, in my experience, sometimes I notice that founders are the problem when it comes time to scale. How can you address leadership development when a founder or CEO may be resistant?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it always ties back to founders being interesting humans. There's a great book from Bain & Co. called The Founder Mindset, and a website as well. And I haven't met a founder yet that doesn't fit pretty squarely in that. So if you ever want to learn a bit more, that's a good read. Probably similar to what I've said before, it's like meeting people where they're at. And so there's some founders that it'll be the first time they've ever led people before, like Larry, our CEO and global founder, that's the case for him. And so it's realizing that he doesn't have those formal management basics. And then it's also what motivates them or what's important to them. And so instead of coming at it necessarily from like, this is a scale and leadership development thing that you need to go through, it might be like, well, this is how we make faster decisions, or this is how you're going to reduce spending, or like by doing this, you'll reduce the admin associated with people stuff that you need to deal with. And so one, it's really kind of trying to frame it to what motivates them. And I often pitch things as experiments. So founders often have a product mindset. And so by pitching it as an experiment, like, here's something I want to pilot with the team. Like, I want to do this over a 12-week period, small bites. Are you good for me just to run with this? Or like, I'm going to run with this. Tell me otherwise. It tends to be more my approach with founders. Yeah, so meeting where you're at, data is really good as well. But then also at the same time, running with experiments, I find, kind of gauges their curiosity a bit as well.
Keeps them interested, and there's always the outcome that they can't predict, which is always good. Thank you so much to those who've submitted the questions. Please keep them coming. There's a bunch coming through, and we'll get to them at the end of the session. Last question, ladies, before we wrap. What is the one key piece of advice you would like to leave the audience with today? Jen, do you want to go first?
No, I want to go third. I have to think on mine.
That's all right. Right, Sarah, do you want to go next maybe first?
My key piece of advice would be to embrace discomfort and constantly keep a learner mindset. And that's whether you're a HR professional, a facilitator, an L&D person, a leader yourself, which we all are. Everyone has the capacity to have an impact, and everyone leaves a leadership shadow. So taking an open mindset and being comfortable with the discomfort of not always knowing the answer. And I think that's kind of part of the fun. That's why I love the leadership and coaching space. You never get to the end. You never get to the edges. You don't ever just become the leader. It's a process of becoming.
I love that. I love that saying. It's a process of becoming. I kind of wish if I could go back to my very first year of work back at 23, if someone told me that, it would have completely changed my entire perspective on this notion of management and leadership. It's a great line. It's the process of becoming.
Yeah, I think it's a different perspective, right? And if I can share another piece that one of my first managers and greatest mentors, and actually someone who set me on the trajectory to my leadership development pathway, I don't think it's his quote, but I don't know whose it was, but he would always say that people don't need to be managed, they need to be unleashed. And I so strongly believe that. It's not about constraining people, it's about opening up the space and allowing for, and that experimentational approach.
That's great. It's a lot of nuggets for you today, Sarah. That's great. I'm gonna start writing them down. Hiam, any last parting words for our audience?
Super inspirational, Sarah. I am going to go back to the basics. If you don't have your purpose, your values, and your leadership principles really nutted out and done in an inclusive way, it's going to lead to problems down the track. The sooner you figure those out, the sooner that you start living and breathing them, embedding them into every single way of doing things in your organization, the better for you, the less problems you're going to encounter down the road, the less monkeys that will be hanging off your back in terms of issues that you're going to have to be solving, as Jen put it at the very opening of this session. So yeah, just get the basics figured out and it'll pay off in the long term.
Makes sense. Jen, lucky last.
I've got mine now. I'm actually in Luke Lazarus just posted one around what's a strong leadership principle. One of our draft leadership principles in CIF is what's that one thing, like 1% that you're doing to be better every day. And so I think there's an element of that as a leader, there's an element of that with your product, and there's also an element of that in terms of building things in the flow of work that helps build high performing leaders if you are in the people space as well. So what's that extra 1% you're going to do today?
Question. It's one that I haven't planned, but I'm really curious by it. What is the one book you would recommend reading to the audience?
I have so many. I love books so much. I have so many books.
Maybe 2 or 3, because I'm a bit of a book fan. I'm curious now. What is the 1 or 2 books that you would recommend, or podcasts that you would recommend to the audience to give a bit of a listen to in terms of creating change, inclusive and diverse change in the organizations, but also really being able to develop that growth mindset within the organization?
So I do have a podcast that if you are in the tech space and do like going into like weedy, how do you actually do it instead of just really high level advice. There's a podcast called In Depth, and it's by First Round Review, which is a venture capital firm, and they speak with leaders across the business every week or every other week, and they go really weedy on like what were some of the people problems that you have to solve, and like how did you go about it, how did you build your first leader program, if you're a founder, how did you make your first hire. And so just getting like really weedy with these like absolute rock star tech leaders, love that. And then something that's a little bit left field, but it's a book called An Astronaut's Guide to Life on Earth, and such a good read. It's nonfiction by an astronaut, and he talks about like the principles around teamwork and having to build for that experience for the fleeting time that you're in space, but everything that you're doing is pretty much serving those that then are on that journey in space. A lot about humility, a lot about teamwork, and ultimately leadership. And I love just the different lens, and it was a completely eye-opening experience and learning a lot about what it's like to be in space.
It's very, very timely with all the Bransons up there at the moment, isn't it?
I know, I was just thinking that as well.
Sarah, any books or podcasts you'd like to recommend to the audience before we wrap up?
There are so many books, it would be really difficult to choose, but there is a podcast that immediately comes to mind. So there's the Brene Brown's Dare to Lead podcast, which is all round phenomenal. Literally every speaker she has is, as you said, Janine, just full of nuggets. It's like a 6-pack nugget deal in every single episode. It's phenomenal. But one that I will recommend, and I'll pop the link in the chat, and I reference it without fail every week. It's called Inclusivity at Work, the Heart of Hard Conversations, and it features Iko Bethia, who is just someone I want to be when I grow up. She's this phenomenal woman of colour from the States. She wrote an open letter to organisations, philanthropy and higher education around doing the work around racism, essentially. And it's great. It's all about that transformational leadership. It's embracing the suck. It's wading into the difficult conversations. It's being there and doing the work in a way that isn't transactional or isn't a checklist. It's a phenomenal podcast, and there's actually a part 2 as well. So if anyone's curious on where to start around D&I, that's where you start. I'll pop it in the chat.
Good, great. Thank you so much, Sarah, for sharing that. And Hiam, lucky last, 1, 2 or 3 podcasts, books.
So many, but I would have to agree with Sarah on the Brene Brown Dare to Lead book. There's also a great Dare to Lead hub where you can actually download some amazing resources that I frequently use. I think they're fantastic. She's very generous with both her research resources, templates, one-pagers. So I'd say that's a really practical one. A book that I couldn't put down recently was better, a surgeon's notes on performance. I think for the times we're in, I think I was just really interested in that one, Atul Gawande. And in terms of podcasts, there's so many, but I want to actually plug a great platform, a learning platform called Tiger Hall, which curates tons and tons of great podcasts from business leaders all over the world that you can then thread together into little trails for your team or for your organization. I think it's kind of the future of learning. We're so getting used to listening to podcasts. Now, how can we learn from, say, a trail of podcasts that are curated from a number of business leaders on a specific topic? So Tiger Hall is a great platform that I rate highly.
Right.
It's also got a great range of intersectional speakers as well, really culturally diverse backgrounds, different experiences, different organizations. I was so impressed as a coach using one of those trails, how diverse and intersectional those speakers were. So it was really impressive.
Yeah.
Great. Well, and on that note, everyone, that's a wrap. So a big thank you to our three powerhouse people leaders, Jen, Hiam, Sarah. Your insights have been invaluable, and we are also appreciative of you taking the time with us today. Thank you to our incredible audience for the questions that you guys have posed. We will get to it later, and we'll share the recording later this week, and along with all of the references to the books and the podcasts you've just heard. And please watch out for the rest of our Inclusive Leadership Series webinars, which are coming in the next couple of weeks. So have a great day, everyone, and stay safe.
Thanks, Janine. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.